We all read texts. It might be a newspaper article, a journal article for more academic purposes or professional development, or reading novels or poetry either for pleasure or, again, as I said, for academic purposes. The question is, how do we understand the quality of our reading of texts or writing of texts? And how do educators engage their learners with their reading and writing of texts? In this lecture, I will talk about these aspects. I will talk about the transactional processes involved in the activities of reading and writing. But before I proceed, I think it's important to talk about what I mean by transaction. Transaction is a two-way process. It involves two entities. So it could be a transaction of goods between two people, or money between two people, or maybe an institution and a person, or several people. Now you may think, how does this concept of transaction apply to reading of texts? Well, text is seen as the other, the entity, and the reader is the other person. Text involves a set of words that have certain pattern, and it is this pattern of words that stirs up emotions in a reader, that brings forward certain elements of our memory and activates our consciousness. Reader, on the other hand, brings certain experiences, his or her past experiences, into reading of that text or making meaning of those words. And therefore, this process of reading becomes a transactional process. Now, reflect upon your past experiences of reading of texts, any text, and think about whether it was a one-sided experience based on your understanding of the meaning of transaction that I just explained. Think about it. According to Rosenblatt, every reading act is an event or a transaction, a meaning-making process that involves a reader and a text in a particular context and a particular time. Text is referred to as set of symbols, verbal symbols. Or one can say these are set of signs that are capable of being interpreted as verbal symbols. Now, in deriving a meaning, the reader takes a particular stance, adopts a selective attitude, which means reader brings some elements of his or her personal history forward. That personal history might have an imprint of social, cultural, historical, or political environment. And thus, in bringing these aspects forward, in bringing some elements of these aspects forward, there is some purpose to reading, some expectation from the verbal symbols that one reads. And even if it's vague, the reading process begins. There are 4 tenets to reading of texts. Readers draw from the well of their past experiences, present interests, and meaning making. They are guided by the stances they take. Readers compose their understanding in social contexts and in particular time. And thereby, reading is a transactional process. Now let's look into the activity of writing. Do you think these tenets of writing also apply to writing of texts? Take a few seconds to think, please. You're right. Writing too, just like reading, is a transactional process. It involves a transaction with personal, social, historical, cultural, political environment. It also occurs in certain circumstances and a particular time, under particular external or internal pressures. External pressures could be maybe a task assigned by your institute, or standards of writing accepted in your specific culture, in specific country, or a specific university. Or an external pressure could simply be sustaining oneself in this world. Internal pressures, on the other hand, are performance, trying to adjust to the new cultural demands. This especially applies to students who move from one country to another. The standards of writing that are accepted in one institute might not be accepted in the other institute or other country. And therefore, young students or mature students, they have to navigate their way through these contradictions, their present interests, bring their past experiences, and mold themselves into new demands of writing. Therefore, just like reading, there are 4 tenets of writing as well. Writers also, like readers, draw from the well of their past experiences, present interests, make meaning in terms of external and internal pressures. Writers are guided by the stances they take. They also compose their understanding in social contexts and in particular time. And writing, like reading, is a transactional process. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is, it's not that when you're reading a text, you start fantasizing some things. The point is to read the text closely, to follow the pattern of words in the text, to make meaning with it. And on the basis of that pattern, you derive from the well of your experiences, from the reservoir of your experiences. Just like if somewhere there is fire, and a person wants to extinguish that fire and there is a manual nearby, that person would read those signs very carefully in a set pattern. Hence, reading also demands that kind of focus. So in this lecture, we have understood the transactional aspect of reading. We have understood the transactional aspect of writing. We have understood the tenets of reading and writing literary text. And there is also a personal objective which you have also engaged during this lecture, is that you have reflected on how you read and write. To conclude, in the transactional process of reading and writing, individuals continually interpret and reinterpret things, which means that individuals continually engage with meaning-making and sense-making processes, which are key part to transactional process. Meaning-making is social in nature. You make meaning with the other, which could be other person, or when we're reading and writing texts, it's the texts. And sense-making is the internal text that you make when you're making those meanings. And this process is an ongoing process. And that makes it transactional. Hence, transactional process involves continuous awareness of individuals interacting with the text.